Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well, and we won't talk about foreign policy today unless it comes to our mind. I'm thinking about talking about this court case. Major breaking yesterday when the Supreme Court, ruled finally on this Baker's case and how they're going to handle this whole thing, the controversy over religious freedoms and the right to run your own property. It was between Masterpiece Cake Shop and Colorado Civil Rights Commission, and they've been fighting. This case has been going on for almost 6 years, and it's cost millions of dollars and bankrupted the Bakers, the company that was charged. They had what I see as a token victory, and very token, because long term I'm not sure how much it's going to help, because the way I see this, it was micromanaging of what civil rights are all about, what discrimination is all about, what religious liberty is all about, and how much expression you can have. And they were micromanaging this. And all I keep thinking, the favorite few words in the Constitution is the Congress shall write no laws regarding religious and of expression. But you say, well, they're not writing laws, they're just ruling on the laws. No, the Supreme Court writes laws, and that's what they're doing. They're micromanaging laws of discrimination, which are impossible to write and be fair to everybody. And then they're writing detailed laws and rules of understanding what religious liberty is all about. Well, it says write no laws, and yet this thing has been going on. To me, it's very, very complex, and the court, I think the whole case is a reflection of the complexity that is so unnecessary, because it's interventionist. It's interventionist social matters, civil liberties, and discriminatory laws that are passed. And all they can do is move the chairs around a little bit and say, well, on this one hand, we do this, on the other hand. And the whole thing, I think, is contradictory. The whole thing of the baker, they don't say, well, he owns a shop, it's his shop, and he can have volunteer customers come in. Oh, no, that you can't have. At the same time, they shouldn't be dealing with religious liberty and saying, well, this religious liberty to say that I don't have to follow the anti-discriminatory laws, is something that has to be upheld. They were trying to weigh two things, which my conclusion is, I think it's impossible to do what they were trying to do, and that's why it's messy. But I guess we can give a little bit of applause for at least a moral victory for these individuals that stood up and said, don't I have a right to do this? And probably somebody said, use the Religious Liberty Clause. Of course, we would like to use another argument and make it more inclusive, that would endorse a free society that endorse property rights.
Yes, and you're right. This has gone on for a long time. It was 2012. You were still in office. We were still in Washington. These couple of fellows, Mullins and Craig, walked into this cake shop and asked the gentleman to bake them a cake for their wedding. He said, no, I'm not going to do it, because of my religious beliefs. He had refused other same-sex couples in the past and said, I'm not going to do it. So they, instead of finding another baker, they decided to make trouble, and they filed a discrimination suit. Colorado Civil Rights Commission has pretty strong power on these things. The commission ruled that he was discriminating against people. The government agreed with him. The courts agreed with him. He's discriminating. They came down hard on him, said, not only do you better bake this cake, you got to train all your people to be much more sensitive to these types of people, and this and that. Finally, they got a little bit of light when the Alliance for Defending Freedom is a conservative 501c3, I think, that sues the government. They got involved and they petitioned the Supreme Court to hear the case. And in June of last year, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in their next session, which now we just got the ruling on yesterday.
See, one reason why I think this is impossible is because they're dealing with something called discrimination. They really can't define it. Everybody thinks they know what they're talking about, and that's being unfair to people in certain groups, because rights are divvied up among groups. You have gay rights, women's rights, and that's not the way it is. Individuals have rights. So if you dealt with that, you wouldn't have all of this problem that we have. But the discrimination is something that is done every single day hundreds of times. Everything we do is discrimination. Every choice we make is discrimination. No matter what you do, you pick one thing over another. You pick your friends and your allies and your churches and your schools and your associations. But all of a sudden, that was something we sort of understood in our earlier history. But all of a sudden, it decided that there are two different things. You have private property and private rights, maybe what you do in your own house. But that doesn't mean that your private house is different than your private store. And they said, oh, well, yeah, people were in the stores. They were doing terrible, bad things. Yet who established all that? I put so much pressure on the government, having established the standards that lasted for long. It was born in segregating, slavery. And then when they tried to get rid of that, then we had Jim Crow laws. And then we had the government, segregating in the military. If they want to stop the discrimination, and I have a few other things I might mention, we need to stop the government from discriminating. They have control of so much through regulation and monetary policy and spending policies. They are the worst discriminators there ever could possibly be. And then they're picking on this and dealing with the freedom of an individual that owns a store and says, why do you have to pester me with making me do something that I find abhorrent? Oh, you're not allowed to think that way. We have to straighten out your thinking.
And they're the worst discriminators because they have a monopoly on force. So there's no way of moving on.
There you go.
And Ryan McMacken had a good piece on the Mises Institute website that we both had a look at. And he pretty much summarizes the arguments pretty well from our perspective. But he points out that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission clearly was discriminatory against the baker. He said that they made clear that the governments, i.e. the commission, simply substituting their own bigotry in place of the alleged bigotry practiced by small businesses. They ridiculed his religion, his faith, and this and that, doesn't count, that sort of thing. And and the Supreme Court noted that the members of the commission were hostile to his beliefs. And McMacken goes on to say, as we just said, that the government-imposed bigotry is far worse than the private sector because you can always go to another company if you need to. If one company is discriminating or bigoted or rude, you can't go to another government, unfortunately.
And the group of people who are most anxious to use force to arbitrarily regulate all these things and everything that we do happen to be people they call themselves they're pro-choice. Yeah. And they're the worst. They don't permit choices from other people on what you own and what you do and what religious freedoms are all about. But they claim that they're the ones who protect choice, and of course that's a different argument. But that's all I think we're talking about is freedom of choice. And we know in economics that there was a theory in economics originally that one side of an exchange has to benefit at the expense of the other, which was completely fallacious because it isn't like, well, if I sell you something, I'm benefit, you benefit, and I lose. No, both sides benefit. And that's the way with social things too. People coming together, they voluntarily associate. They don't use force, and both people benefit. But we have these mischief makers that want in and regulate that voluntary choice of people coming together. But when they do this, what they're forcing is associations. And when they do that, they're the ones like you just quoted. They're the ones that are using force and discrimination. They're more the discriminating group than somebody that wants to say, hey, this is against my beliefs. Do I have to do this? He shouldn't have to do this. Oh, and then they say, well, he was doing something immoral. Well, people do a lot of things that are very aggravating and not nice in a free society. And if you can't accept that, you don't want to live, in a free society. But a free society, and I've often said, when it comes to, things like the First Amendment, you don't have the First Amendment to talk about the weather. Yeah. You have the First Amendment to say controversial things, and you always err on the side of permissiveness. And you don't have to. You should have the right to do that. You should have a right to criticize the government, and that's getting tougher all the time. But this report, this finding by the Supreme Court, I think just a little bit of help for this poor guy that went through the agony of this, but it hasn't helped unless libertarians and constitutionalists come to the rescue and say, this is our opportunity to try to explain this thing to them. This is a mess. You know, they're micromanaging the laws that are called anti-discriminatory, at the same time micromanaging what you define religious values are and freedom of expression are, rather than the Congress, which means write no laws. But why was the Supreme Court's allowed to then, and the executive branch allowed to write? No, it was gone. Went without saying. Only the Congress was given the authority to write laws. So this is a far cry from a more plain society, and I think it all goes back to the definition of rights. Individuals have rights, and they ought to be equal justice under the law, rather than putting people in groups and fighting and fuming against each other, then having a Supreme Court come in and listen to these arguments that didn't make a heck of a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think conservatives, especially social conservatives, may be tempted to cheer this decision. But as we were talking about before, this is probably going to come back to haunt them, to really sting them, because the main point of the Supreme Court decision is that this, because of free speech and freedom of religion, this individual in this particular case was okay in refusing to bake this cake. But, you know, McMakin again cites Rothbard when he argued that religious expression and free speech are simply types of property rights. So why not cut to the chase and deal with the actual issue, property rights itself, rather than derivatives, different types of property rights?
It's absolutely right. If you have a newspaper, your building is property, and they can't invade there and tell you what you have to do. If you have a TV station, you can't go into the TV station when I want equal time. They tried to force that on it. So the property really doesn't. The same way with religious beliefs. No matter what religious you have, if you have a building and say this is ours, and you can't come in here and lecture us and dictate to us, and yet they go get around that and say, well, this is what you can do. You can't talk to the government. Yeah. You can't lobby the government because you're a so-called religious group like this. But no, I think it's the property rights. And a lot of this, you take in education is another place where government gets overly involved and violates our liberties. Because if you have a private school or homeschooling, the books are determined by the people who are running the school, and the people who come to it know what they are, and they have an understanding. So if you blur the definition between private and public, then who owns it? Well, nobody. Everybody owns it, and nobody owns it. And who dictates it? The politician. And I keep thinking one of the greatest abuses has gotten worse over the decades has been who gets to pick the books. So the cultural Marxists are picking the books.
Oh, yeah.
They distort history, they distort economics, and they lecture us on that. And yet, if it's private, if you don't like it, you leave. And this is why the whole system is biased against us. I think people say, well, you're wearing out this issue that government is the problem. But believe me, I believe the government is the problem, and a little bit of government is okay, but the best government is self-government, local government, family government, community government, very, very limited, based on the rules of no violence. And you start off our program by talking about no violence in this and no use of force to have their way. And under those circumstances, if you have a contract, an economic contract, either one has the right to walk away from it. But that isn't the way it happens. Employments, the employer and the employer can't walk away. Then he's discriminating. But if you're employed by somebody, you can walk away. Everything has to be equal. Other than that, one side is enslaved. If this baker had been forced to do this and sent back, and they never raised some of these questions, he becomes enslaved. But I think in many ways we have become enslaved, with the dictates of our government.
Yeah, and ironically, the Supreme Court decision itself was discriminatory because it cited, quote, the cake owners, quote, deep and sincere religious beliefs as justification. Well, what if you just kind of had lukewarm religious beliefs, yeah, right? But you still didn't want to bake the darn cake. You were lukewarm. How do they test you? How do they test your mind to see how deep your faith is? It's so strange. I wanted to read you this one quote, actually, because I think it really is interesting. This is from the Supreme Court decision. And this, I think, shows how logically flawed, and really, really on shaky intellectual ground. And I'm certainly not up to the par of the justices, but to me, this seems kooky. Here's what they said. Any decision in favor of the baker would have to be sufficiently constrained, lest all purveyors of goods and services who object to gay marriages for moral and religious reasons, in effect, be allowed to put up signs saying no goods or services will be sold if they will be used for gay marriages. It's something that would impose a serious stigma on gay persons. So the cake guy, okay, you can do it, but not you, and don't you dare put up a sign. It's crazy.
Well, and they don't understand economics nor current events. I mean, we went from the age of slavery and all the difficulties back then. But now, they say, well, you mean to say you'd let them put up a sign and say, ABC, you're not invited here, you cannot come in? Yes, you have a right to do that, because in a free society, you have a right to be an idiot.
Yeah.
But you don't have a right, you don't have to impose your idiocy on somebody else, and that's what government does. But it's idiotic. It doesn't work. They would be out of business in a week. It would be insane. And yet they're using the same force of intimidation of wanting to run things, and philosophically, they're doing exactly what they abhor.
And you think that some person next door wouldn't open a cake shop saying, gay couples welcome here,
yeah.
next to the other one. Great, it's a great business. It's a great business deal.
Yeah, well, I keep harping back to this whole thing that we put people in groups, and we don't have rights because we belong to a group. We have rights because we're individuals. But justice has not been, used as individuals. Too often they put them in groups, and there's been some unfairness. I think the Justice Department is very bigoted in what they do. They're biased. They're very political. And just look at what's going on today with the Department of Justice, the CIA, and the FBI, and all the mischief they're all in the political system. That's very, very discriminatory of what they're doing, and they're not sorting it out very, very quickly. But the whole thing is the people who feel biased. The Department of Justice is very biased, but what about the IRS? I mean, they use the IRS all the way. One of the things that got me annoyed at Nixon early on wasn't Watergate. It was the fact that I found out he was using the IRS to punish his enemies. And they always do that. So then what if they collected taxes legally? How do they pass it out? By discrimination. All spending is discriminatory. Printing money, what do they do? They discriminate against us, the average person, and they give the benefits to the very wealthy and to the bankers and to foreign policy and the wars. Yeah. So that is the discrimination. If you look about this is serious, and it's a basic principle, but it's the discriminatory power that the government has to control the economy, and we're now in the business of controlling the world as being as managing a world empire. That the discrimination we have, and some people have said, I think one of the things that Trump has trouble understanding is he didn't realize how much power he was inheriting becoming a president. It's usually kept sort of quiet, but it is overwhelming. They were sort of making fun of the fact, well, he discovered he had the power to pardon people, this sort of thing. So no, there's way too much power. That power is always discriminatory, and it's not discriminatory in the protection of liberty. It's always discriminatory to protect the special interests and the people who pay their way to get access to the government.
And what a mess we have. But I'm going to end on a positive note, Dr. Paul, because we want to end happy, and I don't want to... I would like to announce that we finally have our tickets on sale for our get-together in August. Our conference on August 18th. Our focus is on the media and war. This is a topic that's at the forefront of everything we're doing now, how the mainstream media colludes to try to keep independent media out, and how independent media is doing the job that the mainstream media used to do and should be doing. This is a focus. We'll also have great individual speakers in addition to our sort of mini focus of the conference. Tickets are on sale right now at an early bird rate, so save money, get them bought right away. It's a limited space. Dr. Paul, we've sold out every time we've done this conference. I'm sure we will again, so get your tickets now. There's always someone 2 weeks or 3 weeks before saying, oh gosh, I was waiting to get my tickets. And I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. The room only holds a certain amount of people. We got discounted room rates if you're going to travel to DC and join us. It's always a great get-together with like-minded people. That really is the way to frustrate the warmongers and neocons, for us to get together.
Very good. And I'd like to just close with emphasizing the fact that we have a government way too much involved, and it's driven by fear. People are driven by fear that if they're not involved excuse me, economically, as well as in the social areas, there would be just chaos. But I think the opposite is true. The government gets involved and becomes very discriminatory, and people are become very fearful. They think that free people can't exist. They are insecure. They don't think, they've been taught and conditioned to be dependent on the government. And I think the goal that we have who believe differently is to convince people that you're better off assuming responsibility for yourself. That you cannot depend on the government because it becomes discriminatory. That's what it is. It's discriminatory in its force. And there's no reason why we should fear liberty. Because in the social sphere, you give people the right to do what they want, and they can mess up. There's no doubt about it. But in the other thing is you're responsible. You get the rewards and the penalties. So if you have problems with it, then you shouldn't be so fearful of it. In economics, the most productive, freest, and richest society are always the ones that recognize individual liberty. So there's good practical arguments for that, but people tend to just say, "Oh no, we're afraid to be left alone, and we have to be taken care of." But the whole principle of liberty and emphasizing individual liberty is to bring people together, because some people use their freedoms in a different way. Some people use their civil liberties differently. Some people use their religious beliefs differently. And this all should come together, and we should all defend liberty because we want to lead our lives as we so choose, as long as we don't hurt other people. And people don't understand that, but instead of saying, well, we have to get control of the government because we want the government to protect my religion but not yours, my economic well-being not yours, that sort of thing. No, the goal should always be for us to work for the protection of liberty. And believe me, if we limited that responsibility to the government and get them out of the business to running the economy, running our lives, and policing the world, tell you what, we'd all be a lot better off. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report.